with the president and other African leaders heading to Russia for the second leg of their peace mission. Yesterday, they met with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Meanwhile, security personnel and journalists who were stuck in Poland are expected to return home tomorrow. For more, we're joined by eNCA senior reporter Aviwe Mtila, who joins us from Warsaw in Poland right now. Aviwe, thank you for your time. Before we focus on the movement of the president just yet, I just want to spend some time speaking to you about the experience that you and your colleagues in the industry had. More than 20 hours on a plane, some of it in the air, most of it on the tarmac at Chopin Airport in Warsaw, finally being allowed out and into a hotel. Can you just bring us up to speed what has happened with your cohort, your grouping of South Africans since last night, and what's been communicated to you at this point about why you were kept where you were, what we know was or was not on that plane, and what happens to you from here?
Good morning, Marcel, and it talks to the myriad of issues that we faced essentially on the ground. That also seems to suggest that there are a lot of geopolitical issues. We left the Waterkloof Air Force Base on Wednesday night at around 10 o'clock, heading, of course, to Poland. We arrived on Thursday at around 1:30, and we weren't allowed to disembark. Only yesterday afternoon, which is Friday, since we have the exact same time, we were allowed to disembark at around 3:30. That's at least 26 hours plus since we arrived on the Chopin Airport here in Warsaw, Poland. We were stuck in that flight essentially, and we were told there are issues of permit, and we've now come to understand, of course, that it's the weaponry that was accompanying those 120 Presidential Protection Services personnel that wasn't allowed inside Warsaw. So these are some geopolitical issues that even the head of the PPS, General Wally Rodo, suggested that these could be racially driven, but of course it also talks to the geopolitical issues. For example, on our way here, we had to roam around the Mediterranean Sea itself for at least 2 hours as we tried to get clearance to go into the Italian space. There were issues there, and finally we got that clearance and we were allowed to make our way. This ordinarily doesn't happen. Even these permits and clearance issues ordinarily do not happen, but because now there is this peace talks that are essentially happening both in Kyiv, which happened yesterday, Kyiv, Ukraine, and those that happen, well, are set to happen today, of course, between the African Union delegation as well as the president of Russia today. There seems to be some interference. I understand the stance of Poland and its close alliance, in fact, with the US suggests that there's a lot of opposition to what may be happening. In fact, according to some of those experts and some of those presidential personnel, I beg your pardon, protection services personnel that we've had on the ground. If you talk to our experience, Marcel, now I had to buy the top that I'm wearing here in Poland because as we speak, our luggage is still in that SAA chartered Airbus, as of course we weren't allowed to disembark with our luggage. Also the weaponry, of course, accompanying the protection services themselves is still stuck in that luggage. Essentially the mission itself and those 120 personnel that were supposed to be side by side the president, protecting him both in Ukraine as well as in Russia, of course, in the second leg of those peace talks. They made a trip for nothing. They will be heading home tomorrow, going back to Waterkloof in South Africa tomorrow, having not done a single mission that they were supposed to do. Ourselves, we're reporting in Poland of missions and peace talks that happened both in Ukraine and the one that's happening the second leg today, that's happening in St. Petersburg in Russia. We're all reporting that from Poland because we haven't got clearance essentially to go and join the delegation, of course, that we were meant to join yesterday already in the first leg, of course, that happened in Ukraine, also the second leg in St. Petersburg in Russia.
Aviwe, from where you are at the moment, and I do understand it's difficult because you are reporting for us from Warsaw in Poland. The president had already moved on with the group that was allowed to travel with him, along with African leaders, to Kyiv, where they had their meetings, and now they have moved on to Russia. Did any of the African leaders and their entourage have a similar issue in getting to Kyiv, or did they perhaps not fly via Poland? Because the question is now being asked about whether the South African authorities actually made sure that all their T's were crossed and their I's were dotted, and they did actually do all the paperwork that was needed according to what the Polish authorities had requested of them.
So we've had minimal interaction. You understand the connectivity issues, of course, being inside that flight. We're getting a lot of the information even today. For example, myself, I was told at the breakfast table this morning that the flight that left Waterkloof on Wednesday, heading, of course, to Poland, was the most guarded flight, top 5 around the world of the most guarded flight. That alone, of course, will raise a lot of eyebrows. When it comes to the permit issues, we had those conversations with General Wale Rode, of course, heading that Presidential Protection Services, suggesting that these are diplomatic interference because they never had any of these issues before. They know their protocol, and for example, they were asked to give the original permits of the weapons and the ammunition that was on board, and upon giving those original documents, still they weren't allowed to disembark. There would be issues, for example, Marcel, where they'll be speaking English with the Polish delegates and the police on the ground. Then all of a sudden, they'd switch to their original Polish language. Then, of course, there'd be barriers of communication. Also, just shocking revelations that we heard on the ground. For example, one of the diplomats from South Africa, South African embassy, in trying to negotiate and just ensure that all those that were aboard that SAA chartered Airbus made their way into Poland safely. She was asked to strip naked. She was literally stripped naked in front of male authority, Polish authority. So it's just some of those shocking revelations that we now coming to know of in the full extent, because us ourselves had connectivity issues for the longest times. Imagine we were inside that bus, that chartered Airbus, essentially for at least 3 days there. And now, of course, we don't even have luggage. We have to buy things like toothbrush on this side of the world because our luggage essentially is stuck together with the machinery and the equipment, the weapons that were supposed to be protecting President Cyril Ramaphosa, all stuck in the Chopin aircraft that is actually currently being guarded by some of the SANDF and SAPS officials, of course not trusting what might happen. As that flight currently is grounded, only going to be allowed to leave Poland, heading back to South Africa tomorrow only. Yesterday we had a glimmer of hope as there was suggestion around 11:30 that we might actually be leaving. Even the SAA, the captain of the aircraft himself, made an announcement, was quite jovial, telling us that they have been allowed a certain time and airspace for us to be able to leave. And there were actually diplomatic engagements between the presidency. I remember we had a message coming from Minister Kumuzo Nchaveni, the minister in the presidency, suggesting that, in fact, there are those conversations on the ground to allow us to head to St. Petersburg in Russia to then be part of the second leg of those peace talks. But all of that fell flat. And we were then told just later on in the afternoon, after spending at least 26 hours, that we'd be essentially here in Warsaw, Poland. Then they'd make some sort of arrangements to get us to St. Petersburg. Now it seems like all of those have fallen flat, and we can do the reporting from the Polish side of things, while those 120 at least personnel from the Presidential Protection Services essentially haven't done a single bit of their mission that they were set to do, heading back tomorrow without doing any of that mission.
Another big talking point, of course, is reporting around shelling of Kyiv, that the direction had come from Russia to focus on Kyiv, and apparently there were missiles that were launched. And then on the ground, we had, playing out on social media, spokespeople for the government of the Ukraine almost going head-to-head with the spokespeople of the South African government, saying, talking about whether missiles were or were not directed towards Kyiv, because the presidency spokesperson for Cyril Ramaphosa said, well, we were here and we didn't hear anything. And yet we're seeing reports that some African leaders were taken to safety and the like. What have you heard where you are, Aviwe?
Well, you asked President Zelensky of Ukraine, and he would suggest, of course, making those accusations that President Putin from Russia doesn't even have control of the Russian army, given what happened with those missiles that were allegedly launched. For example, President Zelensky suggests that there needs to be some diplomatic isolation of Russia and accusing President Putin of Russia of being a terrorist. But of course, there were broader talks, if you are to listen in, of the Ukraine side of things and the AU delegation and what they made there. Of course, there are issues of food security because of this ongoing conflict. You understand, of course, we got a lot of grain and a lot of fertilizers from both countries. So the suggestions and the talks even coming from President Cyril Ramaphosa was that this needs to be ended because while we may not be directly impacted, while we may be some thousands of kilometers away from the actual conflict itself, it has a direct impact when it comes to food security. In fact, this is not the first mission of the AU. On the onset of this very conflict between Russia and Ukraine, there was that AU commission that was sent through by the African Union itself to talk on those very issues. So you'd expect that the conversation will actually circulate around opening those corridors in order for those grain and those fertilizers to go through to ensure, in fact, food security in the African continent. But if you are to look at the broader context, of course, you'd understand that Africa itself, as the biggest voting bloc in the UN, the General Assembly itself, they've been time and again since the onset of the conflict itself being pulled in different directions, trying to make these different countries have a stance and take a side in this conflict itself. So them going there, more than trying to resolve the peace itself, it would talk to the AU having some sort of stance and trying to keep a non-aligned stance in terms of keeping its mission being a one that suggests that it must be a peaceful mission, such as the South African stance itself. Of course, it might have been criticized itself, but we've always had a non-aligned stance, which suggests that we are not aligned to war itself, but aligned to peace and achieving that peace via the peaceful means.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Aviwe Mtila reporting to us live there in a brand new T-shirt he had to buy in Warsaw because his luggage is still stuck on the plane along with the other journalists who weren't allowed to take their luggage with them. We thank him for his time. I shudder to think what a T-shirt and a toothbrush would have cost in the Polish zloty, I think, is what their currency is called. We thank him for his time. He'll continue to bring us updates from Warsaw in Poland. They will not be leaving the country. The president, however, and their grouping has moved on to Russia, where they're expected to continue their peace mission conversations there after their time in Kyiv yesterday.